The crystalline halls of the Valfyrian palace had never known such silence. Ambassador Chris stood frozen at the entrance to the throne room, her secondary hearts pounding in irregular rhythm against her ribcage. Every courtier, every guard, every dignitary from across the 17 systems had stopped mid-breath. The usual hum of conversation, the clicking of claws on polished stone, the rustling of ceremonial garments, had vanished as if reality itself had paused. At the center of it all stood a human man named David Ross, and wrapped around him in an embrace that defied every protocol was Princess Lyra, the youngest daughter of Queen Thesha the Radiant. Chris had served in the diplomatic corps for 40 cycles. She had witnessed the signing of the Treaty of Burning Suns. She had stood witness when the Ascent Collective first made contact with the insectoid hive worlds. She had thought herself prepared for anything. This shattered that illusion completely. The human had arrived 3 weeks prior as part of a minor trade delegation. Humans were newcomers to galactic society, barely 2 generations removed from their first faster-than-light vessels. Most species regarded them with polite curiosity or mild condescension. They were weak by galactic standards, fragile things with thin skin and no natural weapons. Their homeworld was a middling ball of rock with unremarkable resources. They had contributed little to the greater civilization beyond some interesting philosophical texts and a peculiar form of entertainment they called music. David Ross had been assigned as a junior trade representative, handling minor logistics for grain shipments to the outer colonies. He was unremarkable, even by human standards. Average height, brown hair going gray at the temples, eyes that seemed tired in the way of someone who had seen too many cargo manifests. Chris had barely registered his presence during the initial ceremonies. Then Princess Lyra had fallen ill. The sickness had come suddenly, a fever that ravaged her crystalline physiology. The royal physicians worked day and night, but the princess grew weaker. The queen, normally composed and terrible in her authority, had begun to show cracks in her facade. Whispers spread through the palace. Some spoke of poison, others of ancient curses. The princess was only 16 cycles old, barely past her transformation into adulthood. Chris remembered the night she had been summoned to the medical wing. She had expected to pay respects to a dying princess. Instead, she found David Ross sitting beside the crystal bed, speaking softly in his rough human language. Princess Lyra was awake, her luminescent skin still pale, but her eyes focused. The human was telling her a story. Chris had listened from the doorway, not wanting to interrupt. It was a simple tale, something about a young girl who befriended a beast that everyone else feared. The human's voice was gentle, unhurried. He used his hands to gesture, painting pictures in the air. Princess Lyra watched him with rapt attention, occasionally asking questions in halting standard. Over the following days, the princess improved. The fever broke. Color returned to her crystalline features. The physicians attributed it to their treatments finally taking effect. The queen ordered celebrations prepared. But Chris noticed that David Ross continued to visit the princess daily, always with another story, always with that same patient gentleness. She learned, through discreet inquiries, that the human had 3 children of his own back on Earth. He carried pictures of them on a small device, showed them to anyone who asked. 2 daughters and a son, all grown now. His wife had died some years ago, which was why he had taken this position so far from home. Lest to remind him of what he had lost, Princess Lyra began to recover in earnest. She started taking meals again, walking the gardens, attending lessons. But she insisted that the human continue his visits. The queen, grateful for her daughter's recovery, allowed it despite the raised eyebrows of the court. What harm could there be in a powerless human entertaining a princess with stories? Chris began to notice changes. Princess Lyra laughed more freely. She asked questions about Earth, about human culture, about things beyond the rigid structure of palace life. The human taught her simple card games. He showed her how to fold paper into shapes. He listened when she spoke about her fears of living up to her mother's reputation, of being the youngest and least remarkable of 7 daughters. The human did not treat her as a princess. He treated her as a person. The other species in the palace found this mildly amusing at first. The Valfyrians were an old race, proud and powerful. Their queen commanded fleets that could shatter worlds. Their technology was millennia ahead of humanity's fumbling attempts. What could this simple creature possibly offer? Then came the attempt on the queen's life. An assassin had infiltrated the palace during a state dinner. The security forces had responded with lethal efficiency, but not before the attacker managed to detonate a plasma charge in the royal gallery. The queen survived, protected by her personal shields. But Princess Lyra had been nearby, thrown by the blast into a collapsed section of the gallery. The human had been serving as part of the diplomatic contingent at the dinner. He had no weapons, no armor, no enhancements. When the explosion hit, palace guards immediately moved to secure the queen. Standard protocol. The princess was secondary priority. David Ross did not follow protocol. He ran toward the flames while others ran away. He dug through rubble with his bare hands, pulling aside chunks of stone that must have been agonizing to lift. When he found the princess, semi-conscious and bleeding from a dozen cuts, he had stripped off his formal jacket and wrapped her in it. Then he had carried her, stumbling and coughing through smoke, until he reached the medical teams. His hands had been a ruin of burns and cuts. He had collapsed immediately after ensuring the princess was being treated. The medical staff had to treat him as well, though human physiology was not their specialty. He would carry scars from that night for the rest of his life. When Princess Lyra woke and learned what he had done, she had wept. Chris had been there, had seen the tears crystallize on the princess's cheeks. The human had been embarrassed by the attention, insisting that anyone would have done the same, but that was not true. Chris knew it. The palace staff knew it. The other diplomats knew it. In a crisis, most beings followed their training, their instincts, their survival programming. They secured what was valuable to them personally. They calculated costs and benefits in fractions of a second. The human had simply seen a child in danger, and the Han acted. That had been 2 days ago. The palace was still recovering. Security increased tenfold. The Queen had personally thanked David Ross in a private ceremony, offering him honors and rewards. He had politely declined most of them, asking only for a direct communication line to his children back on Earth. He missed them, he explained simply. He wanted to hear their voices. Now, as the memorial service for the guards who had fallen protecting the palace concluded, Princess Lyra had approached the human delegation. She had walked past her own family, past the assembled nobility, straight to David Ross. And before anyone could stop her, before protocol officers could intervene, she had wrapped her arms around him and pressed her face against his chest. The silence was deafening. The Queen rose from her throne, her expression unreadable. Chris felt her breath catch. This was a breach of every custom, every rule of conduct. The princess was of royal blood. Physical contact with lesser species was simply not done, especially not in public, especially not in such an intimate manner. David Ross stood very still, clearly uncertain what to do. His hands hovered awkwardly at his sides for a moment. Then, slowly, gently, he placed one hand on the princess's head and the other on her back. He did not speak. He simply held her while she clung to him. Chris saw tears flowing freely down the princess's face now. She understood suddenly that this was not about protocol or politics. This was a frightened girl who had nearly died, seeking comfort from the one person who had made her feel safe. The Queen descended from her throne. Every eye in the hall tracked her movement. She crossed the distance with slow, measured steps, her robes flowing behind her like liquid light. She stopped directly in front of the human and her daughter. For a long moment, she simply looked at them. Then, in a voice that carried through the silent hall, she spoke. Ambassador Ross. She used his title, elevating him from trade representative in a single breath. My daughter has chosen to honor you in a manner reserved for family. I would know if you find this burden acceptable. The human looked down at the princess, still holding her gently. When he looked back up at the queen, his eyes were wet. Your Majesty, he said quietly, I have 3 children of my own. I would be honored to be trusted with the care of a 4th, if only in spirit. The queen studied him for another long moment. Then she did something Chris had never seen in 40 cycles of service. She reached out and placed her hand on the human's shoulder. Then let it be known, she said, her voice ringing with formal authority, that David Ross of Earth is named friend to the royal house. Let none question his place here. The hall erupted in a cacophony of voices, some shocked, some approving, some confused. But Chris barely heard them. She was watching the human, this simple, unremarkable creature from a backwards world, as he continued to hold a princess who had found in him what all the wealth and power of an empire could not provide.